All right, we're back in our grammar tonight, and we are on page 213, if my memory serves me.
Yes, sir.
And it rarely does. Now I'm going to try to spend less time in the grammar and more time in the text talking about the grammatical things, because I think most of this is accessible to you as you read it. Am I right about that?
Sometimes.
All right. So if you have questions as we go through this, then stop and we will entertain them in one form or another. All right. So 213. For those on the tape, we have already prayed. Tense. We are talking about tense. That's a grammatical term as we're using it tonight. Tense. In general, tense in Greek involves two elements. Aspect, which is kind of action, and we'll distinguish that from akinsart in a little bit. So, aspect, kind of action, and time. Aspect is the primary value of tense in Greek, and time is secondary, if involved at all. In other words, tense is that feature of the verb that indicates the speaker's presentation of the verbal action or state with reference to its aspect and, under certain conditions, its time. So notice how he says it is the speaker's representation or the speaker's presentation. Just like with mood. Moods relate to reality, but it is reality as expressed in the text. Right? And so tense has to do with aspect and time as it is being expressed, which may or may not concord with the action itself. Just because you describe something in the aorist tense doesn't mean it happened quickly. I mean, it doesn't mean it didn't have a process just because you describe it that way. All right, the tenses in Greek are the present, future, perfect, imperfect, aorist, and pluperfect. I wonder why in the world he puts them in that order. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Might be a reason for it. I don't know what it is. All right, the element of time. Well, that's past, present, future, in the indicative mood. So in the indicative mood, normally, time is an issue. Time from the standpoint of the writer. So, if the writer writes something and he said, I did something, then that's past from the standpoint of the writer writing at that point. Because I'm doing something, that's present from that same standpoint. I will do something, that's future from that same standpoint. You see. Typically, that's the way it works in the indicative mood. With participles, however, and we learned this, but we'll work it in a little bit. We'll work it in. With participles, it says time is very often involved in a participle, although here it is relative or dependent. Now, it's kind of fashionable these days to deny that tense in participles have any time significance. And I don't accept that view. As a matter of fact, I hung out with one of the leading initiators and proponents of that view some years ago. And I don't think it's right. I think there is typically a time significance to participles. Can you find exceptions to that rule? Yes, but I think it's the exceptions that prove the rule, because in the vast majority of time, the rule applied. But in participles, time significance is not from the standpoint of the writing or the writer. Time significance is from the standpoint of the main verb. So an aorist participle puts the action of the participle before the action of the main verb. A present participle puts the action of the participle at the same time, concurrent to the main verb.
That would kind of be actually using the word after or when.
While or before. Yes, and a future participle is going to put which you don't have a whole lot, is going to put the action after the main verb. Now the confusing part of it is the translation. Because if you have an aorist participle, that participle action comes before the action of the main verb. So if you say, I ate a donut after walking to the store, that would be an aorist participle because walking to the store came before eating the donut, didn't it? But to indicate that action comes before eating the donut, I use the word after, right? Because really, after is modifying the main verb, right? So it's backwards. If I had a future participle, it would be, I ate a donut before walking to the store. So walking to the store happens after I eat the donut. So it's backwards. Now, not only is there tense applied in participles in that way, not from the standpoint of the speaker, but from the standpoint of the main verb. Not only is there tense applied in a participle, but the kind of action, the aspect, is also applied in a participle. All right, and that's why things can get kind of pushed off of normal, because if I want to say I did something before the main verb, I'm going to need to use an aorist. But what if I also want to say that action was a progressive kind of action? I'm going to have to find a way to make that clear in the context. So in that case, an aorist participle could actually have a progressive meaning, but I need to use an aorist to say that it happened before the main verb. Or I might actually use a present participle in that case, because I want to emphasize the progressive nature of the action, but context would make it clear that even though I'm using a present participle, the action came before that of the main verb. See? And that would be an exception to the rule, wouldn't it, at that point? See? But it's for those reasons that I'm pushing off of normal. All right? When you get outside of the indicative mood and the participle in what is termed the oblique moods, then time is not a part of the tense issue at all. All right, top of page 215, he says, to sum up, in general, time is absolute in the indicative, relative in the participle, and non-existent in the other moods. That was an interesting chart here where you can see the use of the present tense in all of the moods. And you can see the use of all the tenses, in fact, in all the moods that they're used with. So you can see by far and away the aorist indicative is used the most, and very close to that is the present indicative. So the present and aorist indicative by far and away are the greatest, and then you have the participle of those two next, and boy, those put together are probably more than all the rest of them, aren't they? So that's kind of an interesting chart there, isn't it? All right, middle of page 215, definition of aspect. The element of aspect. Verbal aspect is in general a portrayal of the action or state as to its progress, results, or simple occurrence. So progress would be indicated by what tenses? Typically. Present and imperfect. All right. Results would be indicated by what tenses? Nope.
Future.
Nope.
Perfect.
Perfect and pluperfect. That's right. And simple occurrence would be indicated by what tenses?
Aorist. Future.
Aorist and future. Now, if aorist and future tenses have the same aspect, which is simple occurrence, what's the difference between an aorist and a future?
Well, it's interesting that a lot of Bible prophecy is written in both of those aspects. You can find it written in the aorist past type of aspect or in the future aspect, as if Isaiah or somebody was there in the future time.
Mm-hmm. And we'll no doubt study that type of aorist. But what's the difference between a future tense verb and an aorist tense verb? Well, time in the indicative or in the participle, right? The aspect is the same. Time is different. Of course, one is past and one is future. But if you get outside the indicative mood, what would be the difference?
You're talking about form or function?
Either one.
The form's going to be different concept.
Well, as a matter of fact, there would not be a difference, and that's why you don't have such a thing as, for example, a future subjunctive. Because what would the difference be between a future subjunctive and an aorist subjunctive? There wouldn't be any difference.
No time
In fact, the form looks an awful lot alike, right? If you think about it, the form of an aorist subjunctive is a lot like the form of a future subjunctive if we had them. We don't have them, we don't need them, because they'd be the same. Maybe they're not aorist at all, maybe they're really future subjunctives. No, we're not go there. All right, so aspect versus Actian sart.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Where did that word come from?
Germany. It's German.
Don't you know German?
Wasn't that a prerequisite?
Yet.
Pastor Lombardo knows Italian.
Da. That's a speedy expression.
Yeah, that's a German word, and you can see the word action in there, right? But the way we're using these words grammatically, aspect is just your philosophical, you might say, theoretical definition of the kind of action represented by the tense. You could talk about the aspect of the present tense, and you could say that it is a derivative aspect. Aorist, undefined. Perfect, it's perfected. It shows action and results. The Actian sart is the kind of action represented by a word of a particular tense in a particular context. So you have tense, you have lexical issues because you have a particular verb in that tense. You have contextual issues because it's used in a sentence, it's used in a paragraph. And so when you get to the different kinds of present tenses, or the different kinds of present tense usages, I should say, right? Now you're talking about Actian sart. You'll see as we go down through the different kinds of presents. Yes.
So I was trying to grasp how you simply define the aspect with the theoretical definition, and the Actian sart would be the how it actually gets brought from this one language to another.
No, that's the Actian sart is. Let me put it this way. You might say, what is the aspect of the present tense? I mean, to be strictly correct in the way we're using this grammatically, you might say, what is the aspect of a present tense verb? But as we're reading the text, we might say, okay, what is the Actian sart of, blepo in the present tense here in, Mark whatever.
Okay, so one is when you're actually using it in context with everything else.
Right. Because if I said, the blind man sees what the sighted miss, that's a particular use, sees. That'd be a particular use of the present tense, right? It really isn't just your typical derivative or progressive kind of thing, is it? That's kind of a proverb, is it? And so we might call that a gnomic, starting with a G, a gnomic present. So in that sentence, the blind man sees what the sighted miss. You could talk about the Atkins art of sees in that sentence, as opposed to the aspect of the present tense. Now, it's a little bit like vocabulary. And we haven't talked a whole lot about this, and it dawns on me that we talk about morphology a lot in beginning Greek, and we talk about syntax in syntax, which is really fitting, isn't it? Syntax is about the study of how sentences go together. Right? Where do we talk about semantics? Right? How words work. Well, in my view, and there are all kinds of different views of these things, and some are better than others, and some might want to reject my view, and that's their privilege. You may not, because you're going for a grade. But in my view, most of the time, a word, well, all of the time, a word has a range of meaning, right? Depending on the context it's used in. But I think most of the time, if not all the time, a word also has a core representative meaning. Really, it's the meaning that the other words, the other meanings kind of derive from, right? So, what is the essential meaning of a word? And then, how is that word used in a particular context? I think it's like that with tense. What's the essential meaning of the tense? And then how does that get mixed up and punched around in the context? Because language is like bread dough. All kinds of things get mixed together to form a lump of dough. And then that lump of dough can be, that if everything's following the rules as you would expect, you have a nice round lump of dough. But that lump of dough can get punched and misshapen. So sometimes a present participle might have an aristic kind of Atkins art, right? Because of the context. So context then reaches around and starts punching sometimes on that bread dough and makes it, a different shape than you might expect it to be.
So,
See what I mean?
So the Atkins art, like talking about words, the aspect would be just kind of a general dictionary definition of a word. The Atkins art would be how the actual idea of that word comes through in the context.
Well, if you would substitute the idea of tense for what you said, yes. Aspect is kind of the dictionary definition of tense, of what's a present tense kind of action. Dictionary definition. Atkins art is how that is applied, or how that is pushed one way or another in a context, or it might be completely pushed to the opposite in a context. See? So that you could have an aristic present, for example. See? Right? So about words, let's think of a particular word that's very interesting. What range of meaning can you describe for the word run? In other words, what are some of the various uses for the word run? That has a very broad, in English, the word run has a very broad range of meaning, doesn't it? So you could draw a big circle for the range of meaning for the word run. Now I think in the middle of that circle, somewhere, roughly speaking, there is kind of a root kind of meaning for the word run, isn't there? But what are some meanings for the word run?
To operate something.
Okay, to operate, particularly maybe machinery. All right, and a machine can run.
Nose can run.
Your nose can run.
A politician can run.
A politician
A runner
can run. All right, a runner can run. You can kind of tell right
can
now.
run.
with
Nylons
this.
can run.
All right, nylon, right?
Oh, that's
Hate it when
weird.
that happens.
Right there.
Huh? I know, that's a good one, huh? What else?
It's used as a place. to
Salmon
clean
run
up the river.
Salmon.
Okay, salmon can run, and they don't even have legs.
Or a salmon run, like, yeah,
But yeah, there's a noun, you
Run
know,
or-
a salmon run is the noun, but we're talking about the verb here, right?
Yeah.
I didn't know we were.
Well, that's another good point, that, you know, that word run can also be a noun in English.
Because we have a ski run.
We're doing the verb, okay?
Well, you can have a run of, well, good or bad luck, can't you? We could probably go on, and almost probably get that many more if we thought about a verb.
How about a run-on sentence?
You could have a run-on sentence. A sentence can run on, can't it?
Class can run.
So can a Greek class, yeah. All right, but I think there's an essential meaning to the word run that the others derive from. But what do you think that is?
Ongoing action.
Move quickly.
Well, movement is related to it, but I think the central idea of the idea to run is an animate object, a person or an animal, using feet to move quickly, to run. You see, and so inherently in the idea of running is movement. See, so now I can have a movement of the nasal region, and now my nose is running, right? A politician can run. I mean, that doesn't literally mean run, but he's trying to move toward getting into office. Salmon can run.
Political race. So.
They call it a race.
Race.
Yeah. See, so there's all that metaphor that moves into politics, right? And so I think you can do that with words. You can ask yourself, what is the essential idea behind a word, and then you can ask, well, okay, how is it used now in this context? And there isn't always, a clear relationship between the two of those things, is there? How is it that a car runs? Well, you get the idea of movement again there, don't you? But sometimes, the derived meanings for a word can be pretty far afield from what you might consider to be the, essential meaning of the word. Now, whether or not this is linguistically correct or not, and I think it does have some merit linguistically, because you can think of the history of the word run. Now, I haven't done a study on that, but I'll bet you that the earliest meanings of the word run had to do with a person or an animal moving quickly on their feet, right? And from that derived these other meanings. But even if you think it's not linguistically valid to look at it that way, and I think it is, it sure is helpful to us as we view words and how to work with them. And you need to know in the context, and you see the word run, and we know this, just by experience, and we do it automatically. We need to be able to do that in Greek too. Now, when you see the word run, you don't necessarily force that word to mean move quickly on your feet. But you can take the word run and use it in a context that you've never heard it before, and probably understand what the meaning is, because you know the essential meaning of the word run. The first time you heard a politician is running for office, you probably didn't have to go look that up. You probably intuitively knew what that meant. Or the first time you heard about salmon running upstream, you probably didn't think they can't run, they don't have feet. You probably understood, that the idea of movement is there. And so that's our innate natural ability to do language that we need to make sure that we apply when we're doing Greek, and realize that innate ability to do language was in operation for both the writer and the readers of the biblical text. See? All right. Aspect versus Atkins, or however you want to say that. Any other questions about that?
Has there been some metamorphosis of meaning from Bible times until now? Like there has in our own language. Bad used to mean something bad, but now if you're a young person, if you're bad, you're good. So
Well,
it's some kind of an idea.
Yes, there has been, I'm sure. I mean, that's the way language works. It probably is not to the extent that we see today in English, because we have a different mentality than people had in most of history. We go around thinking we can change language just because we want to.
Right.
So we've probably seen English change more in the last 50 years than it changed in the 500 years before that. Not only for that reason, but also for the reason of life is changing around us. And probably that's what promotes it. Our life is changing so fast, and our language has to change with it. We just think that change in language is normal, so it's okay if bad means good. Besides, it's cool, right? But yeah, things. We talked about the word arabone, pledge, in Ephesians 1, which came to mean engagement ring. And so that's, probably pledge is near the central meaning of the word. And, in context, in the future, it came to mean engagement.
So still the importance is to understand the mind of the writer or the mind of the times,
That's right.
the historical.
Yes, that's right. That's historical, grammatical, literal interpretation. So that's what was happening at that time, at the time of the writing. Some words actually flip their meaning or have a completely different meaning. Like the word nice. The word nice used to have a negative meaning, and now it has a positive meaning. So it's actually flipped. When I say used to, I don't mean 10 years ago. I mean a long time ago. Think of the word mean, and I don't know. You got to be careful of hayseed linguistics and hayseed etymologies. But think of the word mean. I haven't looked in a dictionary to see how that actually developed, but I could guess. What does mean mean? Well, I'm talking about mean as it is used in the opposite of nice, right? If somebody's mean, that's pretty negative. Well, I wonder if the word mean started off meaning something like average, average and mean. And if a person is just average in the way they treat somebody, they're not very good, right? And the meaning of that kind of degenerated till it meant not just, not mean, but mean, right? Now, I don't know that that's really true, but I can guess that maybe that's how that word developed. But in any case, words do develop in that way, you see, as they're used through time.
I know stink is the same way.
Yeah, stink?
Yeah, in Old English it used to be good. Something stinks. Well, it smells. Oh wow, it smells good, like a garden.
Is that right? So stink was a positive thing.
Now,
Well,
you don't want to stink.
maybe then the stink was a sign of life, which we want to remove ourselves from now. I don't know, but that's an interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. All right. Now it's interesting. At the bottom of page 216, he talks about internal or progressive action. So for progressive action, he looks at it very interestingly. He's saying it's like looking at the action from the inside or close up, seeing the progress of it. Then there's external or summary, and that would be an heuristic or undefined kind of action, where you're just looking at the thing as a whole. And then there's perfective, where you're looking at the result, which is durative, ongoing, but the result is of an action that is seen as just happening. So it's an externally viewed action. It just happened, heuristic, but the result is viewed internally. It's continuing and going on. Now, that's just how it's expressed, right? The action may well have been a long process, or at least a process. But you're not caring about the process of the action. You're caring about the duration of the result at that point. You see. And the idea of portrayal versus reality is important, but I think we got that down when we talked about mood. A good way to look at it is the difference between a photograph and a motion picture. Right? The present tense kind of action, the durative kind of action is like a motion picture. The heuristic kind of action is like a snapshot. And the perfect combines them. You have a snapshot and the results like a motion picture. All right, if you don't have any questions, we'll move on and talk about the present tense for a moment. Page 219, with reference to aspect, the present tense is internal. Now, remember, we're talking theoretically about the present tense. We're talking about basically the core of its meaning, not how that meaning may be applied or I could say misapplied or pushed to one way or another in a particular context, right? With reference to aspect, the present tense is internal. That is, it portrays the action from the inside of the event without special regard for beginning or end. But it makes no comment as to fulfillment or completion. The present tense's portrayal of an event focuses on its development or progress and sees the occurrence in regard to its internal makeup without beginning or end in view. It is sometimes called progressive. It basically represents an activity in process or in progress. Remember now, that's the aspect. Time is present tense in the indicative, concurrent with the main verb for a participle, and time is irrelevant or not applicable in the oblique moods. Okay? Now, specific uses of the present tense, and he divides them into narrow band, broad band, and other than that. So there are a couple of uses in the narrow band, and that is instantaneous present. So already we have an aristic or punctiliar present. Okay? Now, why does that happen? Because you want to say something is happening in the present time, but the aspect, or I should say the Atkiansart, is clearly not progressive by nature. The Atkiansart is, we're going to see some of the text we're going to read tonight. The Atkiansart is punctiliar or undefined by its nature. All right? If you said in English, he tells him the answer.
He told him the answer.
Or I am well, it's kind of hard to get it across in English, but telling someone something is probably a punctiliar kind of concept, isn't it? Now you could tell a story, and that could be progressive, but maybe the word "answered" is better in English, right? I answer you. That's in the present tense, but it doesn't necessarily need to be progressive. No, yes. So in other words, logically, you can only conceive of certain activities as punctiliar. You see what I mean?
What's a good example of punctiliar present? In a lot of the passages of Scripture and Mark that we looked at, they often use the third person indicative present, active, which very well could have been a punctiliar present. It sounded better to say that he said, or
well,
as opposed
that's
to
a
he
different.
said.
That may be a different thing going on, and we'll get to that usage too. It could be this, but it may be something different going on. All right, so we have an instantaneous present. We have a progressive present. Now, the progressive present is pretty close to the heart meaning of the present tense in its aspect, isn't it? All right, that's kind of, you might say that's kind of the basic, unembellished. That's the lump of dough without it being, misshapen or punched or pushed or whatever. So those are the narrow band uses. The broad band uses are the extending from past to present. Well, extending from past to present. Like in this example, I am serving you all these many years. Right? That's almost like a Jewish thing to say, isn't it? Can't you just hear that in that context? I am serving you all these many years. Well, that's a present, and it's meant to be progressive in the way we're viewing it. See, but it's really meant to draw on a progress that's been happening in the past and coming into the future. So you see how context, you see how the lexical meaning of the verb itself and or the context around it can influence the actual meaning of the tense. See how that happens? So extending from past, present, and then the iterative present. That means something happens repeatedly. where it says, he is falling into the fire. If you just did the present tense in a real literal beginning Greek kind of way there, right? He is falling into the fire. What that really means is he falls into the fire from time to time, or he falls into the fire often or regularly, or however you want to look at it. See, iterative, iteration. It happens over and over. Customary, habitual, or general present. So the customary present, example, I am fasting twice a week. Well, you can see that that's showing a habit, isn't it, or a custom. It's not necessarily a custom that's part of culture, like it's our custom to put it, kill a tree and drag it in the house, right? That's a cultural custom. It's not necessarily that. It's what is customary to you, right? I am teaching Greek on Monday nights. That would be a customary present. And I could say that on Wednesday. That'd be perfectly legitimate, wouldn't it? I could say on Wednesday, I am teaching Greek Monday nights. And that would be an example of that.
We do that all the time. People, when they ask you, what are you doing? And, well, going to seminary.
Right, yeah, you see somebody you haven't seen in a while. Hey, what are you doing? Well, I'm going to seminary. In Safeway? Cool.
Yeah.
But that's trying to apply aspect in a way that doesn't respect Atkins. You see what I mean?
That's foolish.
That's foolishness, And you might point that out next time you see someone do that. Actually, it could be a great source of humor.
Good thing I understand you through the Arkansas principle of the aspect, because our language would be out of control.
I hope you try this stuff on your wives.
Yeah.
This is great stuff for your
We
wives.
must go on crusade.
Protect the Atkins. All right, the gnomic present. You can think of the little garden gnome if you like to, or not. The gnomic present is like a proverb kind of thing, a general timeless fact. Now, everyone divorcing his wife, or the wind is blowing where it desires. The wind blows where it desires. So that's a gnomic present. Special uses of the present. The historic present, or the dramatic present. I kind of like the word dramatic better. The name dramatic present is better, right? Because and we'll see some of these in our text. And you see them a lot in narrative, and you see them in the Gospels, and it is used to make the expression more vivid. So I can say to you, I was driving here tonight, and I saw, I'll tell you, I was driving here tonight and I stopped at a stop sign, 4-way stop. And I saw a car that just pulled up to the stop sign who should have waited. All of a sudden he went out of the intersection, he didn't wait, and the guy in front of me going the 90-degree different way of him, took off as well. And I sat in my pickup and I saw those cars get closer and closer, and I thought they were going to collide. Now I use the past tense. I can tell you the same story using the present tense. I can say, I'm driving to class. I'm sitting at a 4-way stop, and I'm watching this intersection. And all of a sudden, this car pulls up and stops, and instead of just staying stopped, he's going into the intersection. And then the car trying to go in the opposite direction, he's going into the intersection at the same time. They're about to collide. Now see how much more vivid that is? Now, I've had students say, yeah, but you added expression to the second one. Well, yeah, that's part of the point, trying to make a point. But, it does, though, right? It does make it more vivid when it brings the person more into the experience, right? Instead of just hearing a story about it, you can almost see yourself or experience sitting at the intersection and watching this thing happen, right? So that's the dramatic present, or the historical present.
What's interesting about that is we do that. It seems like we do that verbally a lot in English, like you just did. If we're describing something that happened, in a football game or whatever, but we don't write that way very much. But the Greeks did, which is it's interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, maybe we're not writing stories so much. Maybe we don't write too many stories. Maybe we write for other reasons. More formal reasons,
Yeah.
maybe. That's a good point. I like it. All right, the perfective present. An example of that, the Scripture says. Well, the Scripture is saying. But we know that the Scripture has already been written. And we know that, what we're reading is a result of the writing, right? So that a lot of times in the New Testament, when an Old Testament verse is going to be quoted, you actually have the perfect tense. It has been written. A good way to translate that is, it stands written. And really the unchangeable nature of Scripture is being emphasized at that point. Here, Scripture says, well, in some sense that requires us to think in a perfective kind of sense about the writing of Scripture and it still being available. But again, maybe the reason we're using a present here for this concept and not a perfect is why. Instead of to emphasize it stands written and emphasize the authority of Scripture, to emphasize the applicability of Scripture. Scripture says, it's still speaking today, right? You shall not muzzle the ox. Also, when you have some words lend their lexicographical, sort of thing to that lump of dough, and so you have a word like echo, the Son of God has come. So in the present, it means I have come. You've run across that, haven't you? So that's a perfective present. The conative or tendential present describes an action that someone is intending to perform shortly or wants to perform, as the case may be. So in the one example, top of page 229, you are attempting to be justified by the law. Well, there's no word attempting in the original, is there? If you read it literally, it says, who by the law are being justified. Well, he makes the point that obviously Paul's not saying that they really are being justified by the law, but they are attempting to be justified by the law. Right? And in the other example, down below, it says, for which of these works are you about to stone me? Now we have a word in Greek for about to do something, mellow with the infinitive. But here we just have the present on account of what sort of these works are you stoning me? Why are you stoning me? Well, they haven't stoned him yet, right? But they want to. That's not unlike what we do in English, why are you bankrupting me? All right, and then you have the futuristic present, which is fairly self-explanatory. Christ is not going to die. Christ no longer dies. Basically context again, meaning of the verb pushes us in that direction. All right, and then bottom of page 230, present, retained, and indirect discourse. You know that we talked about this before. In Greek, if you have a direct statement and you put it into indirect discourse, John said, quote, I am hungry, end quote. In English, we would say, John said that he was hungry. Now, the original is in the present, the direct quote is in the present, the indirect quote is in the past. Right? But in Greek, you use the same tense. If the original quote is, I am hungry, then you would say, John said that I am hungry. Right? And so you may have a present in indirect discourse that describes an act of the past. Okay. All right. Any questions about the present tense? All right. Nice. The imperfect tense.
Which kind of nice?
Well,
The current nice or the?
the current nice. It's good. The great thing about the imperfect tense is that it's virtually the same as the present tense. Really, it just takes the present tense, puts it in the past, and there you go. So narrow band imperfects, the progressive imperfect is what we're used to seeing. Second one is the ingressive imperfect, and you've seen me translating, he began to do this, he began to do that. You see that a lot in narrative, right? And that's what the significance of that is. It indicates the beginning of an action. It talks about the difference between the imperfect and the aorist and the ingressive, because there is an ingressive aorist as well. So there's two: the broadband imperfects, the iterative imperfect, the same thing. Something is happening, again and again, somehow. Customary, same as the present, but in the past. Special uses of the imperfect: the connotative or the voluntative or tendential. A lot of the old grammars call it tendential present, tendential imperfect. Somebody is attempting to or wanting something to happen. But John was preventing him. Well, John was trying to prevent him. If you take that as a connotative imperfect, you see on the bottom of page 236. The imperfect retained in indirect discourse, same thing as the present, and there you go. Any questions on the tenses of the present or the imperfect? Perfect.